The rain hammered against the windows with the force of an unwelcome guest. He was in the leather armchair, the one that had belonged to his father, with a glass of whiskey forgotten on the side table, his eyes fixed on the void beyond the glass. He was 52 and felt that time no longer moved. It merely repeated itself, morning after morning, night after night, in the dense silence of that house, far too large for a single man. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment below with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. When the knocking started at the door, he thought he'd imagined it. The rain did that, created phantom sounds, echoes of a life that no longer existed. But the knocking returned, more urgent, accompanied by a muffled voice that seeped through the thick wood. He stood still for a moment, the whiskey glass still in his hand, trying to decide if he should ignore it. Nobody showed up there without a serious reason, and a serious reason usually meant trouble. But the knocking continued, insistent, and there was something in its cadence, desperation perhaps, that made him get up. He crossed the wide hallway, his steps echoing on the hardwood floor that creaked in the same old spots. The house knew his movements, and he knew its size. They were old companions in that silent dance. When he reached the door, he hesitated with his hand on the doorknob. From the other side, he heard ragged breathing, a muffled sob. A child. There was a child on the other side. He opened it slowly, with the heavy heart of someone who expects nothing good from surprises. Opening the door, he found a drenched woman holding a little girl against her chest. Both were trembling, not just from the cold, he realized, but from something deeper. Exhaustion, fear, the kind of shiver that comes from within and can't be fixed with a blanket. Water streamed from their hair, forming puddles on the stone floor of the porch. The woman's dark, long hair clung to her face like seaweed. The little girl must have been about 5, maybe 6, and kept her face buried in her mother's neck, her small fingers clutching the wet blouse with a strength that spoke of contained panic. The woman looked at him with a mix of shame and despair that he recognized immediately. He'd seen it before, in another time, in other eyes. It was the look of someone pushed to the brink, with nowhere left to go, making a final plea before giving up completely. There were marks on her face too. He noticed them, even in the dim light, small marks, almost invisible in the rain, but ones he knew well. They weren't from accidents. "Please," she said, her voice broken, hoarse from too much shouting or crying. "Just for tonight. The road. The bridge." He didn't respond immediately. He stood there, hands still on the doorknob, watching the scene as if needing to confirm it was real. As if at any moment the two would simply vanish, reveal themselves to be another trick of loneliness, another illusion of a weary mind. But they didn't vanish. They remained there, trembling, waiting, the rain pounding with renewed violence as if trying to drive them from that last refuge. The woman took a step back, interpreting his silence as refusal. The movement was instinctive, automatic, the gesture of someone who knows intimate rejection and is prepared for more. She turned her body slightly, shielding her daughter, already bracing to return to the storm and wherever they would go next. And it was that movement, the instinctive gesture of someone protecting even when they have nothing, fighting even without strength, that broke something inside him, that made him remember. "Come in." The word came out dry, almost impersonal, but it was enough. She stepped over the threshold carefully, as if fearing she was invading sacred ground. The little girl lifted her head and stared at him with enormous, dark, frightened eyes. He looked away. The house was too quiet for the noise they brought with them, the sound of wet shoes on the floor, the child's irregular breathing, the rustle of drenched clothes. He led them to the living room, lit the fireplace he rarely used, and gestured to the sofa. "Stay here. I'll get some towels." When he returned, they were still standing, as if they didn't dare to sit. The woman wrapped her daughter in the larger towel and used the other to dry her own hair. He noticed her movements were quick, efficient, accustomed. He also noticed her hands, calloused from hard work, and her eyes, always alert, even when looking down. "Thank you," she murmured. "We had nowhere to go. The bridge. It collapsed. I saw the wreckage as we passed." He nodded. He knew that bridge. Old, narrow, suspended over a creek that turned into a river when it rained like this. He'd already spoken with the city council about repairs, but things in town moved slowly. "You'll have to stay until tomorrow. Maybe longer." She swallowed hard, and he sensed the fear that caused. It wasn't fear of him. It was something else. Fear of stopping, perhaps. Fear of being found. The little girl started to cough, a wet, worrying sound. Her mother knelt in front of her, placed a hand on her forehead, then on her chest, listening to her breathing. He recognized the gesture, the same one his wife made when their son had a fever. "She needs dry clothes," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "And you both need something to eat." The woman raised her eyes, and for the first time he saw gratitude there. Not the performative gratitude he knew from charity dinners, but something real, raw, almost painful to witness. He led them to one of the upstairs bedrooms, the one he kept clean more out of habit than use. He opened a closet and took out 2 old shirts, too large for them, but dry and warm. "Put these on. I'll get something to eat ready." In the kitchen he heated soup, one of those canned varieties he bought by the case and rarely ate, and cut some bread. Simple actions that felt strangely significant, carrying a weight he couldn't explain. How long had it been since he'd prepared food for anyone but himself? How long since he'd heard footsteps other than his own, echoing in those rooms? The smell of soup spread through the kitchen, filling the space with an illusion of normalcy. Steam rising from the pot, fresh bread on the cutting board, 2 bowls he took from the cupboard after checking they were clean. These were bowls that had belonged to his wife, that she had chosen years ago at an antique market. He didn't use them. He never had a reason. Now he did. When they came down, the little girl was wearing the shirt like a dress that dragged on the floor, the sleeves so long they completely covered her hands. Her mother had rolled up her own sleeves several times to free her fingers, and her hair was pulled back in a makeshift bun that was still dripping. They looked too small in those large clothes, too fragile in that vast space. They sat at the table with the same hesitation as before, as if afraid to take up too much space, to make too much noise, to exist too much. He placed the bowls in front of them without ceremony, then served bread and butter. The child ate slowly, but she ate. The woman barely touched her food, her eyes flitting from her daughter to the window, then to the door, as if calculating distances and possibilities. "Your name?" he asked, more to break the silence than from actual curiosity. "Marina." A pause. "And she's Julia." He nodded. He didn't offer his own name, and she didn't ask. That established a tacit agreement. They didn't ask. He didn't tell. It was an arrangement that suited him. The night advanced slowly. He settled them in the bedroom, brought extra blankets, and made sure the little girl was warm. Marina thanked him again, her voice low, almost inaudible, and he left before she could say anything else. Back in the leather armchair, with the whiskey glass finally in his hands, he listened to the sounds of the house. They were different now. Light footsteps upstairs, cautiously measuring the new territory. The creak of a bed unused for years, protesting against recent weight. The murmur of one voice calming another, humming a low lullaby he didn't recognize, but which reminded him of similar melodies. From other nights. Another time. Sounds of life where before there had only been echo. sounds of the present where before there had only been the past. He thought of his son, as he did every night, but this time the memory came differently, not with that sharp, paralyzing pain that stopped him from breathing, but with a softer, almost sweet melancholy. He remembered the way the boy would run through the house on Sunday mornings, shouting that he was hungry, the way he would hug his legs when he was afraid of storms, the way he would say, "I love you, Dad," without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And it was. It had been. Until the day it wasn't anymore, but now for the first time. In 15 years, he found himself thinking not only of the son he had lost, but also of the child sleeping upstairs, of the little girl with frightened eyes, who held her mother as if she were the only solid thing in a world that insisted on crumbling. He didn't know yet, but that night marked the end of something, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something else that had no name or form, but was already beginning to tear through the silence he had so carefully built around himself. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the house, for the first time in years, there were voices other than his own, and he didn't know if that frightened or relieved him. Morning arrived grey, with the rain still beating against the windows in a monotonous, persistent rhythm, like impatient fingers tapping on wood. The world outside remained invisible, just a dense curtain of water and mist that turned everything into indistinct shadows. He woke in the armchair, his neck stiff, and his back complaining about the position. The whiskey glass had tipped over onto the floor beside the chair, forming a small, dark puddle on the rug. He didn't remember when he'd fallen asleep, if he'd truly slept at all. The whole night had seemed like a succession of micro-awakenings, of partial attention to the sounds of the house that now included presences other than his own. He hadn't managed to go up to his own room. Something that night had kept him downstairs, on involuntary vigil, as if he needed to be sure he hadn't imagined it all. As if at any moment he might wake up and discover that the storm, the woman, the little girl, everything was just another figment of his lonely imagination, but he hadn't imagined it. The sounds came from upstairs even before the coffee was ready, light footsteps that knew the spots where the floorboards creaked least, the woman's voice talking softly with her daughter, the squeak of the bathroom door that always complained about its rusty hinges. Sounds of a morning routine he hadn't heard in so long they seemed foreign, even invasive. He stood in the kitchen, his back to the stairs, filling the coffee maker with automatic movements. Hands that knew what to do, even when his head was still confused, waiting. He didn't quite know for what, but waiting. When they came down, Marina was ahead, holding Julia's hand. The little girl was still coughing, a sound that echoed too much in that wide, empty space. Her eyes were red, tired, and her mother wore the expression of someone who had spent the night awake, monitoring breaths. "Good morning," Marina said, her voice small, cautious. He merely nodded and gestured to the table. He'd set out bread, butter, coffee, and milk. Simple things. He didn't know how to do more than that. Marina sat Julia in the chair and prepared a glass of warm milk for her. The little girl drank slowly, her eyes scanning the enormous kitchen with a mix of curiosity and distrust. He noticed she didn't speak. She hadn't uttered a single word since they arrived. "She doesn't speak?" he asked, the question more direct than he intended. Marina looked up quickly, then returned her attention to her daughter. "She does, just not with strangers." The word hung between them. Strangers. That's what they were. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching. "The bridge will take days to assess," he said. "Maybe weeks until they clear the road." He saw her body tense, her shoulders rising, slightly. She gripped the cup between her hands. We don't want to be a bother. If you could take us to town, we could." "There's no town," he cut in. "Not around here. The bridge was the only direct access. The detour goes through private property and takes hours. With this rain, it's impossible." Marina closed her eyes for an instant. Just one, but it was long enough for him to see the weight she carried. It wasn't just the discomfort of being there. It was something bigger, more urgent. "All right," she murmured. "We'll stay quiet. We won't be in the way." The promise sounded fragile, desperate, and he felt a strange unease in his chest. He turned to the window, pretending to assess the rain, but really trying to decide what to do with that feeling. The day passed slowly. Marina tried to help. She tidied the kitchen after breakfast, folded the towels they'd used, swept the living room even without being asked. He watched her from afar, sensing her need to make herself useful, as if that would justify their presence there. Julia always stayed close to her mother, silent, her eyes following every movement. In the middle of the afternoon, the little girl started coughing harder. Marina immediately took her upstairs, and he heard doors closing, water running, her voice singing softly, trying to soothe her. He went up after a few minutes, tapped lightly on the door. "Is she okay?" Marina opened a crack. Her face was pale, worried. "I think she's caught a bad cold. Her fever's rising." He entered the room without asking permission. Julia was lying down, her face too flushed, her eyes glistening with that feverish look he knew well. He approached, placed a hand on the child's forehead. She was warm. "I have medicine here," he said. "Fever reducer and antibiotics if needed." Marina seemed to want to argue, but urgency spoke louder. "Thank you." He brought the first aid kit he'd always kept, a habit of someone who lives far from everything and learned to fend for himself. Marina administered the medicine carefully, then sat on the edge of the bed, a hand on her daughter's chest, feeling her breathe. He stood at the door, unsure if he should leave or stay. In the end, he stayed. "Do you have children?" Marina asked suddenly without looking at him. The question caught him off guard. He took a moment to answer. "I did. A son." His voice came out hoarse. "He died 15 years ago." She turned her face to him then, and in her eyes was a comprehension that needed no words. "I'm so sorry." He shrugged, the gesture too abrupt. "It was a long time ago, but it wasn't, it never would be. Time didn't heal such things. It only taught you to live with the void that remained." Marina looked back at Julia. "She's all I have. If anything happens to her..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. He knew that fear. He had lived with it, and then had lost it along with his son. Night fell heavily once again. Julia slept restlessly, whimpering softly, and Marina didn't leave her side. He brought tea, water, more blankets. He tried to keep his distance, but the house wasn't big enough for that. Or perhaps it was too big, and that's why every step, every presence, echoed louder than it should. Around 2 in the morning, he went downstairs to get more water and found Marina in the kitchen. She was by the window, arms crossed over her chest, looking out into the darkness. She hadn't heard him come in. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She started, turning quickly. She placed a hand on her chest, taking a deep breath. "Sorry, I just needed some air." He approached slowly, filled a glass of water. "Is she doing better?" "Her fever's gone down a bit." Marina ran a hand over her face, tired. "Thank you for everything. I know it wasn't your responsibility." "It wasn't," he agreed, and the bluntness of his reply silenced her. They stood there, separated by the table, but united by shared silence. He noticed then what he hadn't seen before: the scratch on her neck, almost hidden by her hair, the purple mark on her wrist, yellowish at the edges, old but still visible, and her eyes, always attentive to the door, always calculating exits. "Who are you running from?" he asked, his voice softer this time. Marina stiffened. "I'm not running." "You are." She stared at him, and for a moment he thought she would deny it, invent a story, construct a well-told lie. But she did none of that. She merely looked away and pressed her lips together. "It's none of your business. It became my business the moment you knocked on my door." The silence returned, denser this time. She took a deep breath, slowly let out the air, and when she spoke, her voice was laden with something he identified as shame, mixed with anger. "Her father, my ex-partner, whatever you want to call him." The words came out slowly, forced, as if each one cost her a piece of herself. "He wouldn't accept me leaving. He thinks Julia and I are his property, something he bought, that he owns, that he controls." She paused, took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. In the beginning it was just jealousy, then it turned into control. He watched everything, where I went, who I talked to, how much I spent. He'd check my phone while I slept, put a tracker on my car, showed up places I was without warning just to show he could, that he was watching me, that he'd always know where I was. Her voice was growing softer, more tense, and he saw her touching her wrist again, that yellowish mark that told stories she didn't need to verbalize. When I tried to leave the first time, he found me. It was worse after that, much worse. He said if I tried again, he'd take Julia from me, that he had money to hire lawyers, to bribe judges if necessary, that he'd prove I was crazy, incapable, dangerous. And the worst part is, I believed him, because he always got what he wanted. Always. She instinctively touched her wrist, her fingers tracing the mark as if it were a map of territory she knew too well. Then she noticed the gesture and hid her hand under the table, ashamed. This time I didn't warn him. I didn't tell anyone. I grabbed what I could carry and left. I was heading to my sister's house upstate, but then the storm, the bridge. She paused, and he saw the naked vulnerability etched on her face. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition. He knew the weight of guilt, of loss, of the fear that everything would crumble again. "He's looking for you?" Marina nodded slowly. "He always does." He remained silent for a long moment, processing. Then he nodded once, dryly. "Then it's better if no one knows you're here." She stared at him, surprised. You'll help us?" He didn't answer immediately. He just filled another glass of water and walked toward the stairs. "Get some sleep. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." And he went upstairs, leaving her alone in the kitchen, with the rain beating against the window and the certainty that he had just promised something he might not be able to fulfill. But he had promised anyway, because deep down, somewhere forgotten inside him, he still remembered what it was like to want to protect someone, and perhaps he still knew how to do it. The next 3 days dragged on in a strange and silent routine. The rain continued, sometimes lighter, sometimes returning with force, but always present, always shutting out the world outside. Julia slowly improved, her fever breaking, her cough diminishing, but Marina insisted on keeping her quiet, resting as if rest was the only thing she still controlled. He watched them from afar. Marina tried to make herself invisible, cleaning when he wasn't looking, cooking simple meals she left ready without fuss, keeping Julia always close and always quiet, but it was impossible not to notice their presence. The house felt different now. There was light in windows he never lit. There were low voices echoing in the hallways. There was life, and that bothered him more than he'd imagined. One morning, he came downstairs and found Julia alone in the living room, sitting on the floor with an old book she'd taken from the shelf. She turned the pages slowly, her small fingers tracing the faded illustrations with an almost religious reverence. The yellowed pages rustled faintly under her touch, releasing that characteristic scent of old books, paper, time, forgotten memories. He paused on the threshold, unsure whether to enter or retreat. The scene caught him off guard. There was something painfully familiar about it, The way the morning light fell on the little girl, the absolute concentration on her face, the way she bit her lower lip when she turned a page, exactly like... He stopped the thought before it went too far. The little girl looked up and saw him. She didn't startle this time. She just watched him with that strange seriousness of children who grow up too fast, who see things they shouldn't see and learn lessons they shouldn't learn so early. "Is this your book?" she asked, her voice low, shy but clear. It was the first time he'd heard her speak. He approached slowly, looked at the book she held. He recognized the cover immediately. It was his son's. An adventure story he'd read and reread until he knew every word by heart. "It was," he replied, the word coming out drier than he intended. Julia lowered her eyes. "Sorry, I shouldn't have taken it." She began to close the book, but he raised his hand, a gesture that surprised him as much as it did her. "You can keep it, if you want." Julia stared at him, her eyes wide, undecided. Then she hugged the book tightly against her chest, as if she feared he might change his mind. "Thank you." Marina appeared on the stairs at that moment, her gaze going straight to her daughter, then to him, trying to understand what had happened. He merely nodded and left before any words could be exchanged. But something had changed. He didn't know what exactly, but he felt it. In the afternoon, he needed to go to the shed out back to get extra firewood. The rain had paused, and the air was heavy with that thick humidity that entered his lungs and clung to his skin. When he returned, he found Marina in the yard under the porch, trying to fix a fence that had collapsed in the storm. She was on her knees in the mud, her hands dirty, struggling with wet boards that wouldn't fit. He watched for a moment, her stubbornness, her need to make herself useful even when no one asked. "You don't need to do that," he said. Marina, startled, almost dropped the hammer. She stood up quickly, wiping her hands on her already dirty pants. I saw it was broken. I thought I'd help." "You don't need to," he repeated, and walked over to her. He took the hammer from her hand, assessed the damage. "That fence has been like that for years. It makes no difference." She stood beside him, unsure what to do with her now empty hands. "I need to do something. I can't just stand still." He understood. He knew that feeling, the need to keep your hands busy so you don't think too much. "Can you cook?" he asked. Marina blinked, confused by the change of subject. "I can." "Then cook." "It's been a long time since I've had a real meal." She hesitated, then nodded. It was a tacit agreement. She would cook, she would take care of the house, and thus she could feel that she wasn't being a dead weight. He would allow it, because deep down he knew she needed it to maintain her sanity. That night she made a simple chicken and vegetable stew with biscuits, seasoned with herbs he didn't even know he had in the pantry. The food was simple, but smelled like something he hadn't experienced in a long time, something that felt like home. The three of them sat at the table for the first time. Julia ate slowly, her eyes flitting from her mother to him, still cautious but less frightened. Marina served, smoothed her daughter's hair, checked if she was eating properly, and he simply watched, feeling a strangeness he couldn't name. "It's good," he said, and saw the relief on her face. "Thank you." The meal continued in silence, but it wasn't the heavy, empty silence from before. It was different, almost comfortable. Afterward, while Marina washed the dishes and Julia drew at the table with crayons he'd found in a forgotten drawer, the phone. It rang. He answered it in his office, closing the door behind him. It was Mark, the property manager for the neighboring estate, a guy who stopped by once a month to check on things. "Hey, Miller, everything all right over there?" "All good." "This rain is a killer, huh?" "The bridge is completely gone for good. They say it'll take months to rebuild." A pause. "Some folks showed up asking about you?" He became alert. "What folks?" "A few guys, 2, 3, I'm not sure. They asked if I knew if anyone was living in that old house on the river bend. I thought it was strange because nobody's lived there for years. I asked if they were police and they brushed me off. I found it weird. Have you seen anyone strange around? Miller looked through the crack in the door. Marina was drying a plate, her back to him. Julia was humming softly, focused on her drawing. No, he lied. Nobody. Well, if you do, let me know. I didn't like the look of those guys. They had that trouble-seeking vibe, you know. I know. He hung up and stood there, his hand still on the phone, his heart beating a little faster. So it was true. Someone was looking for them, and they were close. He returned to the living room, trying to keep his expression neutral, but Marina read him immediately. She put down the dishcloth and approached, her voice low, urgent. "What's wrong?" He looked at Julia, still engrossed in her drawing, oblivious to the tension. He signaled Marina to follow him to the kitchen away from her daughter. "People are asking about you, on the neighboring properties." He saw the color drain from her face. Marina put a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling, with something close to panic. "He found me. Not yet, but he's looking." He crossed his arms, thinking fast. "Are you sure you didn't tell anyone you were coming to this area?" "No, I swear. Only my sister knew, and she would never say anything." "Cell phone?" Marina shook her head. "I threw it away before I left. He used to track it." "Car?" "I left it abandoned 3 towns from here. I took a bus afterward, and I came on foot when the road became impassable." He nodded, assessing. "So it's a random search. He's sweeping the area, asking everywhere. Eventually he'll get here." Marina closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to control herself. When she opened them again, there was determination there, along with the fear. "I'll leave, now. I'll take Julia and go. I won't put you at risk." "To go where? On foot in the rain with a sick child?" He shook his head. "No. But you stay until I find a safe way to get you out of here." "Why?" she asked, her voice small, confused. "Why are you doing this?" It was a good question. He had no answer, or perhaps he did, but he wasn't ready to admit it aloud. "Because you're here, and because I said I'd help." Marina looked at him for a long moment, and he saw gratitude there, but also something more. Doubt, perhaps. Or fear of trusting too much, of depending too much, of allowing herself to feel safe when safety had always proven illusory. "Thank you," she murmured finally, and returned to the living room where Julia awaited her. He remained alone in the kitchen, listening to the rain start again outside, beating against the windows with the same insistence as always. And for the first time in 15 years, he felt something that wasn't guilt or emptiness. He felt purpose and fear. Fear that he wasn't strong enough to protect them. Fear that the man looking for them would be more determined than he expected. Fear that, in the end, everything would crumble again, just as it had crumbled that other night in that other time when he lost everything he loved. But this time, he wouldn't run. This time, he would stay. Even if it meant facing what was coming, even if it meant breaking the silence he had built like a fortress around himself, because sometimes he was beginning to understand silence didn't protect, it only imprisoned. The following week brought a subtle but noticeable change. Marina and Julia were no longer just 2 strangers sheltered by the storm. They had become constant presences, parts of a routine he didn't know he was building. He would wake to the smell of fresh coffee. He would come downstairs and find the table set, the kitchen clean, small gestures of care he hadn't asked for, but which little by little he was beginning to accept. Julia improved every day. Her cough had almost completely disappeared, and she began to explore the house with the natural curiosity of her age. He found her in unexpected places, sitting in the library, leafing through books she could barely read, standing in front of the old photographs he had never taken down from the walls, drawing on the living room floor with crayons Marina had found in a forgotten box. There was something unsettling about it. The way she occupied spaces he kept untouched. The way she brought movement to places where there had only been silence. But there was also something comforting. One afternoon he was in his office dealing with company papers. He still held equity in businesses he managed remotely, when Julia appeared at the door. She stood there, just watching, her hands behind her back, her weight shifting from one foot to the other. "Do you need something?" he asked, without looking up from the documents. "Did you used to work with numbers?" The question caught him by surprise. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "I do." "Why?" Julia shrugged. "My mom says numbers are important, that you need to learn them well so you don't get tricked." He nodded slowly. It was a tough lesson for such a small child, but a fair one. "Your mum's right." Julia bit her lip, thoughtful. "Can you teach me?" He blinked. "Teach you what?" "Numbers, math, that stuff." It was a simple request, innocent even, but he felt something clench in his chest. Teaching. How long had it been since he'd taught anyone anything? How long since he'd had the patience for it? "Your mom can teach you." "She knows. But you know differently." Julia stepped further into the office, brave. "Please." And it was the "please" said with that childish seriousness that disarmed him. "All right. But just for a little while, I have work to do." Julia smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and ran to get paper and pencils. She was back in seconds, sat in the chair beside him, and waited, attentive, her eyes fixed as if he were about to reveal secrets of the universe. He started simple: addition, subtraction, basic concepts she already knew but practiced with surprising dedication. The little girl had a worn notebook Marina must have brought in her backpack, and she jotted everything down with big, crooked letters, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Marina appeared at the door at some point, just watching in silence. He felt her gaze but didn't turn. He continued explaining, correcting with patience that surprised him, realizing with a strange sense that he was enjoying it. Julia's absolute concentration, her genuine desire to learn, the way she listened to him as if every word were an important revelation. When she got a problem wrong, she became frustrated, and he saw her eyes welling up with tears. Not from pain, but from anger at herself, the kind of cruel perfectionism that came from some dark place. "It's okay to make mistakes," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's by making mistakes that we learn where we need to pay more attention." Julia looked at him with those big eyes, processing. "My mom says, if you make a mistake, people take advantage. That you always have to do everything right." It was too harsh a lesson for such a small child, and he understood where it came from. From the man who pursued them, from the man who had turned every mistake into a weapon, every failure into a reason for control. "Your mom is right that we need to do our best," he said carefully, "but she also knows that everyone makes mistakes, even me, even her. The important thing is to learn and move forward." When they finished, Julia carefully put away the papers, thanked him with an exaggerated curtsy that almost made him smile, and ran off. Marina stayed. "Thank you," she said softly. She really enjoyed that. He merely nodded, already returning to his documents. But Marina didn't leave. "Can I ask you something?" He sighed, put down his pen. "Go ahead." "Why do you live here? All alone like this?" It was an invasive, too personal question. He could have simply refused to answer, but he didn't. Because it's easier. Easier than what? Than being out there, with people, with life. Marina approached, leaned against the table, arms crossed. "You are alive." "Am I?" he retorted, and the bitterness in his own voice surprised him. Breathing isn't living, Marina. Waking up every day, doing the same things, repeating the same movements. That's not life. That's just existence. Automatic survival. She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw understanding there. Not pity, but true understanding. As if she knew exactly what he meant because she had lived her own version of that hell. I thought I wasn't either. After I left him, after I realized the time I'd lost, the things I'd stopped living, the pieces of myself I'd let die just to keep the peace. Marina took a deep breath, her eyes distant, visiting places within herself she'd rather forget. I spent months on an autopilot similar to yours, woke up, took care of Julia, slept, repeated, without feeling, without thinking too much, because thinking too much hurt and feeling too much was dangerous. She walked over to the window, looked out without really seeing anything. But then I would look at Julia and understand that being alive was the only option, because she needed me alive, whole, not a ghost walking through the house, not a shadow of what I was. She deserved a mom who was truly present, you know? Who laughed, who played, who felt, even if it hurt, especially when it hurt. He looked away. I don't have anyone who needs me. Don't you? And he realized, too late, the gentle trap he had fallen into. Marina left before he could answer, leaving him alone with the question hanging in the air. That night, Mark called again. Miller, new development. The guys came back. They're offering money for information, a lot of money. And they showed a picture of a woman and a child. Said they're family, that the woman's confused, sick, and needs help. He gripped the phone. Do you believe them? A long pause. No. I've seen people lie my whole life. I can spot it. Another pause. But there are others who will take the money and won't ask questions. You understand me? I understand. If there's anyone there who needs to disappear, they'd better do it soon. He thanked him and hung up. He stood in the dark of the office, listening to the sounds of the house. Marina bathing Julia, the little girl's laughter echoing down the hall, the creak of the floorboards. Sounds of life, sounds he had learned to live without. But now that he had them back, he couldn't imagine what the silence would be like again. He went to the living room where Marina was drying Julia's hair. Both looked at him, and it was Marina who spoke first. Something happened. It wasn't a question. He's offering a reward, showing pictures, saying you're his family. He crossed his arms. Some people will fall for the story. It's only a matter of time until someone remembers I live here, until they come to check. Marina turned pale. She pulled Julia closer, protective, instinctive. How much time do we have? I don't know. Days, maybe less. Then I need to go. No, I can't stay here putting you in danger. If he comes, if he finds out. If he comes, he'll find me first. He approached, his voice low but firm. I know people. I can make you truly disappear. New documents, passage far. Away, a place where he'll never look. But I need time to arrange everything. Marina shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears that refused to fall. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. No, he agreed. But there are things you do because you have to, not because you owe someone. She looked at him as if trying to decipher something hidden behind his words. And perhaps she was. Perhaps she was seeing what he himself didn't want to admit. That protecting them was a way to redeem himself. To prove to himself that he was still capable of saving someone, since he hadn't been able to save the one who mattered most. Julia, who had quietly followed the conversation, let go of her mother's hand and walked up to him. She took his hand, his enormous hand compared to her tiny one, and squeezed it. You're good, she said with the devastating simplicity of children. My mom's scared, but I'm not, because you're good. He looked at the little girl, at the absolute trust in those dark eyes, and felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the wall he had so carefully built, a gap through which light entered after years in darkness. Go to sleep, he said, his voice hoarser than he intended. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Julia let go of his hand and went to the bedroom with Marina. He remained there, alone in the living room, listening to their footsteps climbing the stairs. He looked at his own hand, still feeling the warmth of hers, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think of his son. Not with the usual paralyzing pain, but with a melancholic sweetness. He remembered the way he held his hand when he was little, the way he trusted blindly, the way he believed his father could fix anything, until the day he couldn't. He poured himself a whiskey, sat in the leather armchair, and stared at the unlit fireplace. The house was warm, even without a fire. It was full, even while empty of furniture. It was alive, even though he had tried to keep it dead. And he knew, with a certainty that hurt, that when Marina and Julia left, the silence would return. But this time, he wasn't sure he could bear it. Because sometimes, he was understanding now, solitude isn't a choice, it's a prison. And maybe, just maybe, there was still time to find the key. The danger arrived on a sunny morning, the first in weeks. The rain had finally let up, and the light streamed through the windows with an almost aggressive intensity after so much grey. Marina was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she saw the car on the dirt road. She froze, the cup suspended in the air, her eyes fixed on the dust rising behind the vehicle. "Miller," she called, her voice tense, urgent. He appeared in seconds, following her gaze. A black car, common model, but with that deliberate air of someone who knows exactly where they're going. "Take Julia to the bedroom," he said too calmly. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I call." Marina ran upstairs without question. He heard the door close, the lock sliding into place. Then he turned back to the window, watching the car approach. 2 men, maybe 3. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and waited. They knocked on the door with unnecessary force, the kind of knock that aims to intimidate. He opened it with the most neutral expression he could manage, blocking the entrance with his body. "Can I help you?" The man in front was tall, in his 40s, with the build of someone who spends too much time at the gym and too little time thinking about the consequences of their actions. He wore dark sunglasses, even in the porch's shade, and there was something calculated about his posture. Broad shoulders, chin raised, the kind of presence that seeks to intimidate before even opening its mouth. "Good morning. We're looking for someone, a woman and a child." He took a cell phone from his pocket, with deliberately slow movements, as if he wanted Miller to see that he was in control, that he had time, that he had resources. He showed a picture. It was Marina, younger, maybe 3 years ago, smiling next to a man holding baby Julia. Her smile in the photo didn't reach her eyes. He noticed that immediately. "Have you seen them around here?" Miller looked at the photo with feigned attention, forcing his face to remain neutral while every muscle tensed. He counted 3 seconds before answering, not too fast to seem nervous, not too slow to seem suspicious. "No," he said finally, handing back the phone without touching the device. "Nobody's passed through here in weeks. The bridge collapsed in the rain. You must have seen the wreckage on the road." "We know about the bridge." The second man spoke for the first time, lower, more aggressive. "That's why we think she might be stuck on this side. Someone might have given them shelter." "Not here. Mind if we take a look?" The first man was already trying to peer past him into the house. "Just to be sure. Their father is desperate. The woman's not right in the head. You know how it is. He just wants them both back safe." "I do mind." Miller crossed his arms. "This is private property, and I don't have anyone here but myself." The 2 men exchanged glances. There was something there, a decision being silently made. The first man took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. All right. We don't want any trouble, but look." He took a card from his pocket, extended it to Miller. "If you see them, call this number. There's a reward, a good reward." Miller took the card without looking, shoved it into his pocket. "If I see them, I'll be in touch. Appreciate the cooperation." The man smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nice property you have here. Must be lonely, so far from everything." It was a veiled threat, and both knew it. "I like the solitude." "Yeah, I see that." The man took another step back, but his eyes continued scanning what they could see of the house. "We'll be around for a few more days, asking, looking. If you change your mind about helping, you know where to find us." They went back to the car, but didn't leave immediately. They stayed there, watching the house, talking among themselves, and Miller felt every second like an eternity. Finally, they started the engine and drove off, the dust rising behind them like a trail of menace. He waited until the car was completely out of sight before closing the door. He went upstairs, tapped lightly on the bedroom door where Marina and Julia were hidden. "It's me." The door opened slowly. Marina was pale, Julia clinging to her waist. Was it them? His men. "I'm not sure if he's here himself, but they're looking." He knelt in front of Julia, tried to smile but couldn't. "It's all right. They're gone." "For how long?" Marina asked, her voice laden with an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "I don't know. But they won't give up easily." He stood up, ran a hand over his face. "I need to make those calls now." Marina nodded, understanding. It was time to leave. There was no more time to wait, to prepare. The decision had been made for them. He spent the rest of the day on the phone. He called old contacts he would have preferred never to activate, people who knew, people who could do things the law didn't allow but were sometimes necessary. False IDs, untraceable tickets, safe houses in towns where no one asked questions. It would be expensive, very expensive. But money was the one thing he had plenty of. That night, while Marina was putting Julia to sleep, he prepared coffee and sat at the kitchen table to organize the plan. She came down half an hour later, tired but determined. "Did you manage it?" "I did. Someone will pick you up before dawn tomorrow. They'll take you to another city, far from here. From there you'll take a bus down south. I have an apartment in St. Petersburg, Florida, registered under a company name. You can stay there while I organize your new identities." Marina absorbed the information slowly, nodding. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing." "Miller, nothing," he repeated more firmly. "It's not about money." She remained silent for a long moment, her eyes scanning his face as if trying to memorize every feature. "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't. I have to. You saved us. You could have sent us away that first night, but you didn't. You could have. And turned us in today, but you didn't. You—" Her voice failed her. Marina brought her hands to her face, and for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to cry. It wasn't a hysterical or loud cry. They were silent tears that streamed between her fingers, laden with relief and fear and gratitude and everything else she had held inside herself. He was paralyzed for a moment, unsure what to do. Then, almost against his will, he stood up and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was clumsy, uncertain, but it was there. "You'll be okay," he said, and wanted to believe it was true. "You two will be okay." Marina lowered her hands, her eyes red, but her gaze steady. "And you?" "Me?" "Yes, you. When we leave, what will happen to you?" It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to ask, because he knew the answer, and the answer hurt more than he expected. "I stay, as I always have, in solitude. It's what I know how to do." Marina shook her head slowly. "I don't think so. I think you know how to do so much more. You just forgot." She stood up, and for a moment they remained there, standing in front of each other, separated by less than a yard, but by years of pain and isolation. She raised her hand, hesitant, and touched his face. Just a light, quick touch, but it burned like a hot coal. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding us that there are still good people." Then she went upstairs, leaving him alone in the kitchen with the coffee cooling and a strange feeling in his chest. Something that could be anticipated longing, or fear of returning to who he was before, or perhaps it was regret, not for helping them, but for not having started living again when there was still time. He went out onto the porch, looked at the clear sky for the first time in weeks. The stars were all there, shining indifferent to human dramas, and he thought of his son as he did every night, but this time the memory came with something new. Hope. Hope that he could still do something right, that there was still time to be more than a ghost living in an empty house. Marina and Julia would leave at dawn, and he would stay, but something had changed, and he knew with a painful certainty that the silence would never be the same again, because some presences, however brief, leave permanent marks, and he was already feeling the weight of their absence even before they left. The pre-dawn arrived cold and silent. Miller hadn't slept. He'd remained seated in the armchair, listening to the clock tick, waiting for the moment to wake Marina and Julia. But he didn't need to. At 4 in the morning, he heard light footsteps on the stairs. They were already ready. Marina came down slowly, carrying a small backpack. Everything they owned fit inside. Julia followed behind, sleepy, holding her mother's hand with one hand and the book he had given her with the other. "Is it time?" Marina asked softly. He nodded, stood up. "The car should arrive in half an hour. Coffee?" "No, thank you." But he made it anyway, more to have something to do with his hands than out of actual necessity. Marina sat Julia at the table, smoothed her hair with automatic distracted gestures. The little girl yawned, rested her head on her arm, her eyes closing. "She'll sleep on the way," Marina said, her voice laden with something he couldn't identify. Nostalgia, perhaps, or fear of what was to come. They drank their coffee in silence. It was a different kind of silence than before, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken things, with words neither of them knew how to pronounce. It was Julia who broke the moment. She suddenly stood up, completely awake now, and walked over to where he was. She hugged his legs tightly, her face pressed against his thigh. "I don't want to go," she murmured, her voice muffled by the fabric of his pants. He froze, unsure what to do with his hands. Marina quickly stood up, tried to pull her daughter away. "Julia, sweetie, we've talked about this. But I like it here, I like him." The little girl wouldn't let go, clutching tighter. "He teaches things. He's nice. Why can't we stay?" Marina looked at Miller, her eyes apologizing, asking for help. He knelt down slowly, getting to Julia's height. His hands, large and clumsy, rested on her small shoulders. "Julia, look at me." She obeyed, her eyes glistening with tears that stubbornly refused to fall. "You can't stay because it's not safe. Those men will come back. And when they do, they need to find only me here. Understand? Then come with us." The simplicity of the suggestion caught him off guard. Marina too, because he heard her inhale sharply, as if the idea had never occurred to her. Or perhaps it had, but she hadn't dared to voice it. "I can't," he said, but his voice came out less firm than he intended. "Why not?" "Because this is my prison. Because I deserve to stay here. Because I don't know how to live any other way." But these were explanations too complex for a child, so he just said, "Because my place is here." Julia stared at him with that disconcerting seriousness she had shown before. "No, it's not. Your place is where people like you." And it was as if she had ripped a board from the bridge within him, As if suddenly all the ground he stood on was unstable, threatening to collapse. Marina approached, placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Come on, sweetie, leave Miller alone." But when her eyes met his, he saw the question there too. Silent, but clear. What if she's right? The sound of an engine interrupted the moment. Headlights illuminated the window. The car had arrived. The separation was quick because neither of them could have endured it if it was slow. Marina hugged Miller briefly, a hug that lasted only seconds but which he felt in every fibre, every exposed nerve. She smelled of cheap soap and that subtle fragrance that was uniquely hers, something he wouldn't be able to name but would recognize anywhere now. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice muffled. "For everything. For giving us a chance when no one else would. For believing. For staying." He didn't answer because he didn't trust his own voice. He just tightened the hug for a fraction of a second before letting her go. If he lingered any longer, he wouldn't be able to let her leave. Julia didn't want to hug him. She stood a yard away, looking at him with an expression of betrayal that hurt more than any words could. Her eyes glistened with tears that refused to fall, her lips pressed into a thin line, her chin trembling with the effort not to cry. "You promised," she said, her voice small, broken. "You said you'd protect us, but you're sending us away." He knelt in front of her, getting to her height. He wanted to touch her, hold her, explain in a way she would understand, but he didn't know how. "I am protecting you, Julia. That's why you have to go. Understand?" "No." The first tear rolled down, then another. "I don't understand. I don't want to understand." He watched them get into the car, the backpack on Marina's lap, Julia clutching the book to her chest. He watched the car turn around, its headlights sweeping the property. He watched them drive away, the dust rising, the red taillights fading, until they disappeared around the bend in the road. And then he was alone. The silence returned like a wave, filling every space, every room, every thought. He walked into the house and went straight to the kitchen, looked at the cups still on the table, the chair where Julia sat slightly crooked, the drawing she had left forgotten on the counter. It was a simple, childish drawing. 3 stick figures, one large, 2 small. A house in the background, sun in the sky. A family. He picked up the drawing, sat at the table, and for the first time, in 15 years, he cried. He cried for the son he had lost, for the wife he hadn't been able to save, for the years he had wasted in guilt and isolation, and he cried for Marina and Julia, for the brevity of the time they had together, for the way they had ripped something out of him that he thought was dead. He cried until he had no more tears, until the sun began to rise and illuminate the empty kitchen. Afterward, he dried his face, put the drawing in the safest drawer he could find, and returned to his routine. He cleaned the house, put away the clothes Marina had washed, changed the sheets in the bedroom they had used. He tried to erase the traces of their presence, but every object he touched carried a memory. The following week was the longest of his life. The men returned, twice. They asked the same questions, showed the same pictures, offered even more money. He stuck to the same story. He hadn't seen anyone. He lived alone. He had no information. They didn't believe him, but they also had no proof. They scoured neighboring properties, questioned everyone they could find. But Marina and Julia were already far away, beyond their reach, safe. That word echoed in his mind every night. Safe. He had done it. He had protected someone. He had done something right. But the void they left behind was greater than he had imagined. One night, 2 weeks after they left, the phone rang. He answered without thinking, expecting it to be Mark with some news. "Hello? Miller?" It was Marina's voice. He sat down slowly, his heart quickening. "Marina, are you okay?" "We are. In St. Petersburg, Florida, like you said. The apartment is perfect. Julia started. At a small school, she's doing well. Better. A pause. Did the documents arrive? They arrived yesterday. I'll mail them today. You'll have everything in 3 days. Thank you. Silence on the other end. He waited, feeling there was more. Miller, Julia asks about you every day. She wants to know if you're okay, if you're eating right, if you're alone. He closed his eyes. Tell her I'm fine. Are you? I am. But it was a lie, and they both knew it. She also asks if you still like to teach. Marina hesitated. Because she has a lot of questions, and she says only you explain things in a way she understands. He gripped the phone tighter, trying to control the emotion in his voice. She's smart. Any teacher will be able to teach her. It's not about just any teacher. Marina's voice was softer now, almost a whisper. It's about you. He didn't answer because he didn't know what to say. There's a third ticket, Marina said suddenly. I bought it yesterday, just in case, or for hope, I'm not sure. It's valid for 30 days before it expires. Marina, you don't have to decide now, just think about it, because there's space here. There's a good school, there's the beach, there's life. And there are... She paused, took a deep breath. There are people who missed you. The silence returned, denser this time. I'll think about it, he said finally, and that was all he could offer. All right, that's enough. They said goodbye, and he stared at the phone for a long time after hanging up. The house was silent around him, but it was no longer the comfortable silence from before. It was a silence that hurt, that weighed him down, that suffocated him. He walked to the window, looked at the empty road, and for the first time he allowed himself to imagine a different city, a different routine, a different life, to imagine Julia asking about numbers, Marina smiling in the kitchen, nights that weren't empty, mornings that had purpose, to imagine that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over. The ticket was valid for 30 days. He had 30 days to decide if guilt was stronger than hope, if the past was more important than the future, if staying was courage or just disguised cowardice. And for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't sure of the answer. It was 28 days of internal war, 28 days during which Miller woke up determined to stay and went to sleep thinking of leaving. 28 days staring at the house that had been his fortress and his prison, trying to decide if it was time to open the doors. On the 29th day, Mark showed up without warning. I heard you're thinking of selling the property, the property manager said, getting straight to the point as always. I'm not. No? I don't know. Miller poured coffee, sat at the table. I haven't decided yet. Mark observed him with that shrewdness of someone who has spent decades reading people. Does it have to do with that woman and the little girl? He didn't deny it. It wasn't worth it. They're gone. The guys gave up looking around here. Mark took a sip of coffee. They must be far away now. Safe. They are. Do you know where? I do. Mark nodded slowly, letting the words settle between them. You know what I think? I think you've been here too long. I think you built a tomb around yourself and called it home. He stood up, placed his cup in the sink. But a tomb isn't a place for the living, and you're still alive even if you don't act like it. He left without waiting for a reply, leaving Miller alone with the cold coffee and the words that echoed louder than they should. Tomb. That's exactly what it was. A beautiful, spacious, comfortable tomb. But a tomb nonetheless. He went up to the bedroom Marina and Julia had used. It was clean, tidy, impersonal. But when he closed his eyes, he could still hear Julia's laughter, Marina's voice softly, singing her daughter to sleep. He opened the drawer where he had kept the drawing. The 3 stick figures were still there, faded, but intact. A family. He would never have the family he had lost. His son wouldn't return. His wife wouldn't return. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was room for something new, something different, something that didn't replace what was, but that existed alongside it, in peace, without guilt. He decided that night, as the full moon illuminated the room through the thin curtains. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence that had once been comfortable and was now merely oppressive. He thought of his son. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember not just the death, but the life. The afternoons teaching the boy to ride his bike, the nights reading stories before bed, the tight hugs he returned without a second thought, because back then he didn't yet know that hugs could end, that people could simply disappear. His son would be, how old now? 32. He'd be a grown man. Maybe he'd have children of his own. Maybe Miller would be a grandfather to kids he'd never know. But his son was dead. And living trapped in that pain wouldn't bring him back. It wouldn't honor him. It would only waste the time he had left, turn one tragedy into 2. And he was tired. Tired of carrying the weight alone, tired of punishing himself, tired of pretending that solitude was strength when in reality it was just disguised fear. He called Marina at 6 in the morning. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice laden with an expectation she tried to hide, but that leaked into every syllable. "Miller, is the ticket still valid?" Silence on the other end. Then, so softly he barely heard it, "It is." "Then I'm coming." He heard her breath hitch, then steady itself. "When?" "Tomorrow, if there's still time." "There is." Her voice was firmer now, but there was emotion there, barely contained. "I'll send you the details. Are you sure?" "No," he admitted, and the honesty of the answer surprised him. "But I'm going anyway." "It's a start." "It is." They said goodbye quickly, before either of them could change their mind. He spent the night packing the things he would take, which was almost nothing. Clothes, documents, Julia's drawing. The rest could stay. The rest should stay. They were relics of a life that needed to end for another to begin. At dawn, he locked the house. He didn't know when he'd return. Maybe never. The idea should have frightened him. But strangely, it didn't. The journey lasted 8 hours. 8 hours to think, to doubt, to almost give up 3 times. But he didn't. When the bus stopped in St. Petersburg, Florida, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with colors he hadn't seen in years. Vibrant oranges, soft pinks, deep purples that seemed impossible. But were there nonetheless real and beautiful and alive? The air was different here. It had salt in it, humidity, life. Not the heavy silence of the mountains, but the constant hum of a coastal city. Voices mingling, cars passing, gulls crying, the world in motion. Marina had sent the address and detailed instructions. It wasn't far from the bus station, a 15-minute walk, she said, if he wasn't carrying too much luggage. He had only 1 suitcase. It was all he needed, or all he had the courage to bring. He walked slowly through the streets, observing. People rushing to catch buses, couples strolling hand in hand, children playing in the park even as dusk approached. A normal, everyday life he had forgotten existed. The building was modest but well-maintained, with windows overlooking the distant sea. There were potted plants at the entrance, bicycles chained in the hallway, clothes hanging on the balconies, signs of lives being lived. He climbed the stairs, his suitcase weighing less than he expected. Or perhaps it was he who felt lighter. Each step was a decision being confirmed, each stride a choice being reaffirmed. He stopped in front of the door. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart beat faster. He was really doing this. He was really choosing to live again, to risk again, to allow himself to feel again. He knocked. Quick footsteps from the other side. The door opened, and there was Marina, her eyes wide, a hand to her mouth as if she couldn't believe he was actually there. "You came." "I did." And then, before either of them could say anything else, Julia appeared, running from inside the apartment. She stopped suddenly when she saw him, her eyes welling up with tears, and then ran and threw herself into his, arms with enough force to almost knock him over. "You came! You really came!" He hugged the little girl, squeezing tighter than he intended, feeling her small body tremble with joyous sobs. Over her head, his eyes met Marina's, and he saw everything that didn't need to be said. Gratitude, relief, hope, and something more, something neither of them was ready to name, but which was there nonetheless, growing slowly, carefully, like a plant in new soil. "Come in," Marina said softly. "Welcome." He entered the small but light-filled apartment. The windows overlooked the sea. There were flowers on the table, Julia's drawings on the walls, the smell of homemade food coming from the kitchen. It wasn't his home, but it could be. Julia pulled him by the hand, showed him her bedroom, her toys, her school books. She talked non-stop, as if she had months of conversations stored up, waiting for the right moment to be released. Marina prepared coffee, and the three of them sat at the table, the same way they had in that large, empty house, but in a different way now. Lighter, more certain. "Are you going to stay?" Julia asked suddenly, her voice small but hopeful. He looked at Marina, who held her cup with both hands, her eyes fixed on him, waiting. "I am," he said. "For now. We'll see how it goes." "It'll work," Julia assured him, with the absolute conviction of children. "Because we're family now, and family sticks together." The word echoed within him. Family. Not the one he had lost, not the one he imagined having again, but a new family, built on the rubble of broken lives, raised with care and hope and the courage to try again. That night, after Julia fell asleep with the book clutched to her chest and a small smile on her lips, he and Marina stood on the balcony looking at the sea. The sound of the waves filled the silence between them. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence from before. It was a tranquil, comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words because they already understand each other without them. The city lights flickered in the distance, reflections dancing on the dark water. There was music coming from a neighboring apartment, something soft, melancholic, beautiful. The kind of music that accompanies endings and new beginnings. All at once, Marina had her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze lost on the horizon. He noticed she was trembling slightly, and it wasn't from the cold. "I'm scared," she admitted suddenly, her voice low but firm. Terrified, actually, of trusting again, of believing this can work, of allowing myself to feel what I'm starting to feel. He didn't ask what she was feeling. He knew. He felt the same thing, that paralyzing fear that everything would crumble again, that happiness was just an intermission before the next tragedy. "Me too," he said simply. She turned her face to him, and in the faint light coming from the apartment he saw silent tears streaming down her face. Not from sadness, but from something more complex, relief mixed with fear, hope mixed with caution. "Thank you," she whispered, "for coming, for giving this a chance, for you, for us, for all of this." "No," he replied. "Thank you for giving me a chance, for knocking on that door, for reminding me that there was still life out there." She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and he realized it had been a very long time since he'd seen her smile like that. "It'll be hard," she warned, "starting over, building, trusting again." "I know. And you'll have days when you'll want to go back," to the house, to the silence, to what was safe. I know. And I'll be scared, scared he'll find us, scared you'll realize this was a mistake, scared of allowing someone to get close again and watching everything fall apart. I know. Marina turned to him, her eyes shining in the faint light from the apartment. But even knowing all of that, do you still want to try? He looked at her, truly looked, at the strength she carried on her tired shoulders, at the hope that stubbornly shone in her frightened eyes, at the courage to have fled, to have asked for help, to have knocked on that door in the storm. And he looked beyond her, to the apartment where Julia slept safe for the first time in a long time, holding the book he had given her. "I do," he said, and it was the simplest and most frightening truth he had uttered in years. The following days turned into weeks, weeks of adjustment, of mistakes, of small victories. He found consulting work. He had enough experience to sell, and people who still remembered what he was capable of. Marina went back to school, something she had abandoned when Julia was born, and the little girl blossomed, laughing more, talking more, trusting more. It wasn't easy. There were nights when he woke in a panic, feeling the walls closing in, wanting to return to the familiar solitude. There were days when Marina looked out the window with distant eyes, still watching, still expecting the worst. But there were also mornings with coffee on the balcony, watching the sunrise over the ocean. There were afternoons teaching Julia about numbers and seeing her eyes sparkle with understanding. There were simple dinners full of conversation and laughter, and there was, slowly, something neither of them had dared to expect: love. Not the dramatic love of movies or stories, but the silent love built in small gestures, in coffee prepared without asking, in a hand holding another during a difficult night, in a look that said, "I see you, I understand, and I'm staying." 6 months later, Marina got her divorce. It was difficult, even dangerous, but with the documents Miller had provided and a competent attorney, she succeeded. She was free. Officially, legally, completely. The day the decree came through, they didn't celebrate with a party or grand gestures. They simply sat on the beach, the three of them, Julia building sandcastles while Miller and Marina looked out at the horizon. "It's strange," she said. "For so long I wanted this, and now that I have it, I'm not sure what to do with the freedom." "Live," he replied simply. "That's what you do." "Is it that simple?" "No, but it doesn't have to be impossible either." Julia ran back covered in sand, asking for help to build a taller tower. They helped her, the three of them together, building something that would be swept away by the tide, but that existed there, in that moment, real and beautiful, even in its impermanence. And as they worked, as they laughed at frustrated attempts and celebrated small successes, Miller understood something fundamental. Life wasn't about building things that lasted forever. It was about being present for what existed now. It was about allowing yourself to feel, even knowing that everything is fragile. It was about choosing hope, even when fear screamed loudest. It was about accepting that some losses never fully heal, but that doesn't mean new joys are impossible. That honoring the past doesn't require sacrificing the future. That loving again doesn't diminish the love that was. They were simple lessons, but they had taken 15 years to learn. Or perhaps they weren't lessons themselves, but permissions he was finally giving himself. Permission to live, to feel, to start over. When they returned to the apartment that night, with Julia sleeping on his shoulder, her small but significant weight, her soft breath against his neck, the smell of sun and salt in her hair, and Marina walking beside him in comfortable silence, he looked back one last time, not at the old house physically, because it was miles away, but at everything it represented, the grief, the isolation, the guilt that had turned into a prison. Then he moved forward, because the past deserved to be remembered, but the future deserved to be lived. And maybe, just maybe, he had finally learned the difference. The storm that brought Marina and Julia to his door had long passed. But what was born from that rainy night continued to grow, slowly, carefully, but growing, and that, he was learning, was enough. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.